It's a pleasant day to you, sir. Here is my PowerPoint presentation of Chapter 4, the Global Interstate System. The state has traditionally been the subject of most interest to scholars of global politics because it is viewed as the institution that creates warfare and sets economic policies for a country. Furthermore, the state is a political unit that has authority over its own affairs. In other words, its borders are recognized by other countries. It is assumed that whoever is in charge of those borders has the right to determine exactly what is going to happen in their country. The Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 established the notion of the nation-state and the idea of state sovereignty. Today, the globalization of politics created an atmosphere where the ideas of the nation-state, state sovereignty, government control, and the state policies are challenged from all sides. Is the idea of the nation-state outdated in the contemporary world? If so, what is it that we need to think about as replacements? In this chapter, we will look at regional alliances and the worldwide organizations of states. This manifests the efforts of countries and governments in the world to cooperate and collaborate together. Next, international and regional economic bodies, such as IMF and the World Bank, must also be considered as they often push for neoliberal reforms in the world. The third kind of replacement to the traditional nation-state and the idea of national autonomy comes from the non-state actors. One of these is the private capital groups, including banks and groups of people with the money that can determine the well-being of people in a particular area. Multinational corporation and non-governmental organization, such as the Amnesty International, are the significant organizations that put into questions the strength of national autonomy and global politics, and so on. Global governance in the 21st century. There is a series of specific factors behind the emergence of global governments. The first on the list must be the declining power of nation-states. If states themselves were highly contingent and in flux, it would open the possibility of the emergence of some form of global governance to fill the void. A second factor is the vast flow of all sorts of things that run into and often right through the borders of nation-states. This could involve the flow of digital information of all sorts through the internet. It is difficult, if not impossible, for a nation-state to stop such flow in an easy case. It is likely that such action would be political and unpopular and bring much negative reaction to the nation-state involved in such an effort. For example, China's periodic efforts to interfere with the internet have brought great condemnation both internally and externally. Then there are global problems that single nation state cannot hope to tackle on their own. One is the global financial crisis and panic that sweep the world periodically, which nations are often unable to deal with on their own. ended, some nations have often been and are being victimized by such crises, unable to help themselves. Such nations are in need of assistance from some type of global governance. Effects of globalization to governments. One of the key aspects of state sovereignty is the government. It is a group of people who have the ultimate authority to act on behalf of a state. Each state has its own right to self-determination, and that other countries should not intervene in the affairs of that state unless there are extraordinary reasons to do so. Other countries must recognize sovereignty or the right to govern one's own territorial borders. Each state is autonomous unto itself and responsible within its own system of government to those who are governed. The decision of government established and codified in that particular state, whether or through elections. Elections, especially in democratic society, provide the leadership of the state. In addition, the policy is developed and implemented in the interest of the people of a state by a specific government. A civil society within a state can also act as a counterweight or as a supplement to government. Civil society includes the private economy, educational institutions, churches, hospital, fraternal organizations, and other non-profit organizations. Traditional challenges. External intervention can generally be described as invasion by other countries. For example, when Saddam Hussein was the ruler of Iraq in 1990, he decided he was going to take over the oil fields of Kuwait. He invaded Kuwait and took it over. As a result, he was dislodged by an international coalition led by the United States. Soviet era is another instance of intervention in the autonomy of the state. Russia intervenes in the affairs of people in Crimea who want to become part of Russia again even though they are part of Ukraine. Crimea declared its independence from Ukraine and reaffiliated with Russia. This is a case of how there might be a national identity within a country that is assisted by a neighboring country. Ukraine argues to have autonomy to determine the case for Crimea. As a result, there is a current conflict between Ukraine, not recognizing Crimea's sovereignty, and Russia, not recognizing Ukraine's sovereignty over Crimea. Challenges from national identity movements. The next challenges are part of a national identity or movement. It is important to know that a nation has cultural identity that people attach to, while a state is a definite entity due to its specific boundaries. However, different people with different identities can live in different states. For example, the Kurds reside in several different countries including Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. The Catalans live primarily in Spain, but we can also find some of them in France. Scottish nationalism is other example that challenges the traditional notion of state sovereignty. In 2014, Great Britain had a vote in Scotland to decide whether Scotland was going to become its own autonomous state apart from Great Britain. They vote against it, but Scotland has a significant degree of autonomy now as compared to more than 2 decades year ago. Global economies. The third major source of challenge comes from global economies. Global economy demands the state to conform to the rules of free market capitalism. Government austerity comes from developments of organizations that cooperate across countries such as WTO or World Trade Organization and regional agreements such as NAFTA, the European Union, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN. Global social movements. Finally, we have global social movements. Most of the time, they are not seen as threat, but they are definitely challenge state sovereignty. Social movements are movements of people that are spontaneous or that emerge through enormous grassroots organization. These social movements are transnational movements, which means they occur across countries and across borders. Therefore, states have less control over them. For example, human rights movements create a public sentiment, value, and agenda. The idea is that there are certain rights that states cannot neglect or generally that we call human rights. If a country decides that they are going to have a particular policy, and if the policy violates the international standard of human rights, there is a challenge to the ability of states to fully implement it. An example is the United States' position on the death penalty. This There is an international consensus with a few dissenting countries like China, South Africa, and Russia against the death penalty. This means that if somebody is sentenced by death penalty and somehow he is in a country around the world, there are rules against the state extraditing into the United States. The environmental movement is another example of global social movements related to public policy. There is also an increased role in international organizations like the United Nations and the International Criminal Court in Hague. The role of the non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Borders or Amnesty International and the role of global media. The relevance of the state amid globalization. The state is a distinctive policy community with its own set of rules and practices and that is or less separate from other communities. It has four elements: people, territory, government, and sovereignty. The first element of a state is a permanent population. This population does not refer to nomadic people that move from one place to another in an indefinite time. This permanent presence in one location is threatened by the second element of a state, a defined territory. A territory has clear boundaries. A territory is effective controlled by the third element, government. The government regulates relations among its own people and with other states. This means that the state is a formally constituted sovereign political structure encompassing people, territory, and its institution on the one hand, and maintaining its autonomy from other states on the other hand. It is also important to differentiate the idea of the nation from state. Nation refers to a people rather than any kind of formal territorial boundaries or institution. It is a collective identity grounded on a nation of shared history and culture. Institutions that govern international relations. There are several international organizations that governments of countries around the world and individuals participate in. These include the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, NAFTA, and NATO. There are also non-governmental organizations promoting social and economic growth. Let us look at them one by one. Peace, treaties, and military alliances, the UN and the NATO. Global politics entails relationship of countries and different governments and non-governmental organizations. The United Nations, or UN, is one of the leading political organizations in the world where nation-states meet and deliberate. However, it remains as an independent actor in global politics. The premise for its establishment was the restructuring of the world devastated after the Second World War. The term United Nations was coined by former U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942. Its operations began on October 24, 1945. It is also included that UN, with its headquarters in New York City, was designed to be a place where countries could come to discuss their issues without resorting to violence and war, which had plagued our planet for several years in the past. Maintaining international peace and security became the central mission of the UN after the war. Up to these days, the UN is a major force in governing interest relations. According to the UN, peace and security are maintained by working to prevent conflict, helping parties in conflict make peace, peacekeeping, and creating conditions to allow peace to hold and flourish. Global Economic Associations, the WTO and NAFTA. The next group is an economic association, WTO, or World Trade Organization. It is made up of 162 countries around the world and was created with the goal of increasing free trade. Countries therefore can buy and sell goods from one another without placing taxes on imports or tariffs. In addition, tariffs are used to protect businesses and companies inside their country. Through good in nature, WTO is not without criticism. In fact, a protest in Seattle at 1999 WTO conference led to a major riot, as some said that WTO was more about helping large companies and corporations than it was about helping people. Another famous economic organization is NAFTA. This is an economic treaty between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, in which the three countries trade freely without taxing each other. NAFTA is not without critics either. Some American auto workers protested against NAFTA as several companies moved their factories to Mexico in search for cheaper labor. NAFTA, like WTO, represents the challenge in America of keeping manufacturing factories. Globalization and globalism. Globalism refers to the network of connections that transcend distances of different countries in the world. In other words, the link among countries and people are better associated with globalism, while the speed which they become linked with one another is globalization. If we are to make a stark contrast between globalism and globalization by saying that globalization means connectedness, while globalism is not, it will lead to a confusion that the present is only time in which people get connected, while in the past they were not. But even before the Industrial Revolution, the world was already connected. Through the conquest of different empires, such those of the Romans, many parts of the world become under one rule. We can also differentiate globalism and globalization in terms of its thickness. Globalism is thin. As it becomes thicker, globalization happens. This means that being able to connect countries in the world through a more dynamic and faster way is globalization. Let us take global trade as an example. In the past, the Silk Road served as the trade routes among countries in Europe and in Asia. Aside from the trade of silk between the continents, other products, even illegal ones, were exchanged among traders and consumers. In addition, cultural interactions among people were made through their trades. However, they were felt by a relatively small group of people, most especially those who were actually on the road and did the trades. The connections were not intense nor thick. In contrast to the contemporary world, globalism becomes increasingly thick. Informationalism. This technological paradigm associated with computer science and modern telecommunication that replaces industrialism is called informationalism. These are technology, the media, and the internet. This is not to say that we do not need to produce material goods such as factories, clothes, and food. Rather, exchanging information and knowledge, which is clearly immaterial goods, becomes central in the contemporary world. This is due to the three of the most cutting-edge aspects of the social world in general and globalization in particular: technology, media, and the internet. The creation of the world's first container ship in 1956 and the expansion of air freight greatly hastened the transport of goods all around the world. Global citizenship. Citizenship is associated with rights and obligations. For instance, the right to vote and the obligation to pay taxes. Both rights and obligation link the individual to the state. It also has to do with our attitudes. We need to be willing to engage and to spend time and effort to the community of which we feel part of. Community has traditionally been regarded as something very local. How, then, can the idea of citizenship be transferred to the global level? Furthermore, global citizenship does not automatically entail a single attitude and a particular value with globalization. We must remember that globalization is not a single phenomenon. Rather, there are many globalizations. While some need to be resisted, others are welcome and should be encouraged. There are bound to be multiple futures to multiple globalization. This globalization created enemies because, according to one broad view, globalization failed to deliver its promises. The so-called bottom billion lacks infrastructures and has been disenfranchised. The opponents of globalization blame either westernization or global capitalism. The last topic in chapter 4, which is all about the non-governmental organization or NGOs. Another example of an international organization that was developed out of war is the Red Cross, Red Crescent in Muslim countries. It is considered as a non-governmental organization or NGO. NGOs are not tied to any country. This allows them to operate freely throughout the world. They provide emergency relief such as food, water, and medical supplies for those whose homes or towns have been destroyed by disaster or war. They also monitor the treatment of prisoners of wars and go to conflicts to make sure that no war crimes are taking place. In fact, the Red Cross began as an organization to help those who were wounded during wars. That would be all. Thank you.